October 14th, 2023. The air in Oakhaven, Nebraska, was thick with the scent of cured tobacco and dry sage, the kind of heat that settles into the bone and refuses to leave even when the sun dips below the horizon. It was a Saturday, traditionally a day for rest in this county, but the gravel lot behind the county courthouse was filled with pickup trucks, their engines ticking as they cooled, forming a perimeter around the wooden auction block that had stood there since the 1970s. 5,000 acres of the Thorne Ranch were up for discussion, or so the neighbors had been told. They had come expecting Elias Thorne to bid on the neighboring Miller parcel, to expand the legacy that his father, Arthur Thorne, had built with sweat and iron well over 4 decades. They had come to witness the growth of an empire. Instead, they witnessed a funeral. Elias stood behind the podium, a man of 50 years whose face looked carved from the same limestone that underpinned the county. He wore a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, exposing forearms weathered by decades of irrigation pipe and fence wire. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on the wooden surface of the podium, where his hands rested heavily on a single manila folder. The folder was worn at the corners, the color faded to a pale cream, stained with what looked like oil or perhaps water marks from a long time ago. The crowd, a sea of flannel shirts and skeptical faces, shifted uncomfortably. The auctioneer, a man named Miller who had known the Thornes since before Elias was born, stood to the side, his gavel hovering in the air unused. There was no bidding today. There was only a statement. The silence stretched out, broken only by the wind whipping against the microphone stand, creating a low, humming feedback that sounded like a distant warning. Elias finally looked up. His eyes were not angry, nor were they sad. They were hollow, stripped of the ambition that had driven the Thorne family for generations. He tapped the manila folder once, a dull thud that echoed through the speakers. He spoke softly, yet the microphone carried his voice to the back of the lot, where the trees marked the edge of the property line. He told them he was not buying. He told them he was selling. All of it, the land, the equipment, the water rights, the house where 3 generations of Thornes had been born and died. He was liquidating the inheritance. He was walking away. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. This was not business, this was betrayal. In rural communities, land is not merely asset, it is identity. To sell the Thorne Ranch was to erase a landmark from the map, but Elias did not elaborate on the price. He did not speak of market values or drought conditions. He spoke of a debt that could not be paid with money. He held up the folder slightly, just enough for the front row to see the red seal embossed on the corner. It was a deed, but not for the soil. It was for the water. He mentioned a date written in ink on the inside cover, a date from 30 years prior, a year when the creeks had run high and the neighbors had trusted the Thornes to manage the flow. He said that the signature on that page was not his father's, though it bore his name. He said that the water they had been drinking, the water that had kept the Thorne crops green while the surrounding fields turned to dust, belonged to someone else. Standing near the rear of the crowd, leaning against the fender of an old Ford truck, was Sarah. She was Elias' younger sister, the only other living heir to the estate. She had not been told about this auction until an hour before it began. She watched her brother with a mixture of fear and recognition. She knew the look on his face. It was the same look their mother had worn in the final weeks of her life, when the painkillers stopped working and the truth began to surface. Sarah's hands were clenched around a set of keys, her knuckles white. She knew about the folder. She had seen it once, tucked away in the safe behind the grain ledger wrapped in oilcloth. She had been told never to touch it. She had been told it was irrelevant. But today, Elias was holding it like a weapon. He was not selling because he was broke. He was selling because he was guilty. The auctioneer finally lowered the gavel, not to sell a lot, but to signal the end of the announcement. The deal was already done, signed that morning with a conglomerate from out of state. The land was gone. The crowd began to disperse, not with the usual camaraderie of a sale, but with the quiet tension of a wake. People avoided eye contact with Elias. They avoided eye contact with Sarah. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the gravel. Elias placed the folder back down on the wood, leaving it there as he stepped away from the podium. He walked toward his truck without looking at Sarah. He did not offer an explanation. He did not offer an apology. He simply left the document on the podium, exposed to the wind, as if daring someone to come forward and claim it. The dust settled around the empty block, swirling in the evening breeze, hiding the ground beneath a layer of gray sediment. To understand what happened that day, we have to go back. The year was 1988, and the sky over Oakhaven had not opened in 14 months. The earth had cracked open like a wound that refused to scab, swallowing the rain before it could even touch the ground. It was a time when the price of corn had plummeted and the interest rates had climbed like vines, choking the life out of the family farms. In the Thorne household, the air conditioner hummed constantly in the front office, a luxury that neighbors whispered about but could not afford. Arthur Thorne was 45 years old then, a man with broad shoulders and a jaw that seemed locked in a permanent state of defiance. He was not a cruel man, but he was a desperate one, and desperation has a way of eroding the boundaries between right and wrong until they are indistinguishable. Young Elias was only 10 years old, small for his age, with eyes that missed nothing. He spent his summers trailing behind his father, learning the weight of a wrench, the smell of diesel, and the silence that fell over the dinner table when the bills arrived in the mail. That summer, the silence was heavier than usual. It was late July, the heat shimmering off the blacktop of the county road when the stranger arrived. He drove a sedan that was too clean for this part of the country, gray dust coating the wheel wells like powder. He did not come to buy grain. He came to talk about the creek. Elias was supposed to be in bed, but the house was old, and the floorboards sang when you stepped on them. He lay on the carpet of the hallway, his ear pressed against the gap beneath the office door. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, a haze that caught the light of the green desk lamp. Arthur was sitting behind the desk, his head in his hands. The stranger, a man with a voice like gravel, was speaking about boundaries. He spoke about the aquifer beneath the Miller property to the west. He spoke about how the Thornes had the deeper wells, the ones that tapped into the ancient reservoir that fed the entire valley. He mentioned a document, a revision of the usage rights that had been filed with the county clerk. He said that if anyone asked, the paperwork showed an agreement. He said that if anyone looked too closely, the paperwork would show nothing at all. Elias watched through the crack in the door as Arthur reached for a pen. It was a heavy fountain pen, silver-capped, a gift from his own father. The ink was black, fresh, and wet against the paper. The stranger slid a manila folder across the desk. It was identical to the one Elias would see 35 years later on the auction block, though then it was crisp and new, the color of fresh cream. Arthur did not sign his name with flourish. He signed it quickly, a jagged scratch that looked like it hurt his hand. He did not read the pages again. He simply pushed the folder back toward the stranger, who tucked it into a leather briefcase without a word. There was no exchange of money visible, no handshake of celebration. There was only the sound of the ceiling fan chopping the humid air and the distant croak of a bullfrog from the drying creek bed outside. When the stranger left, Arthur remained in the chair for a long time. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the liquid amber in the dim light. He did not drink it immediately. He stared at the safe tucked behind the framed photograph of the family standing in front of the barn. The photograph was taken in better times when the fields were green and the smiles were easy. Arthur opened the safe. Inside, there were stacks of bonds, deeds to the livestock, and the original title to the land. He placed a new folder inside, one he had prepared before the stranger arrived. This was the copy, the one the stranger had not taken. He wrapped it in oilcloth, a precaution against the dampness of the safe, against the decay of time. Elias shifted his weight on the hallway floor, and a board creaked, a sharp snap in the quiet house. Arthur froze. He did not call out. He did not open the door. He simply closed the safe door with a heavy thud and turned the dial, the mechanical clicks echoing like a countdown. He knew his son was there. He knew that the boy had heard the conversation about the water, about the rights that did not belong to them, about the neighbor whose land would turn to dust so the Thorne crops could survive. Arthur stood up and walked to the door. He opened it slowly, looking down at Elias, who was scrambling to his feet, guilt flushing his cheeks. Arthur did not yell. He did not explain. He placed a hand on Elias' shoulder, heavy and warm. He told him that some things were done to keep the family fed. He told him that water was just like land, something you had to fight for. He told him that what happened in this room stayed in this room. Then he sent the boy back to bed. But Elias did not sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to the house settle, listening to his father walk back into the office and pour another drink. He could hear the ice clinking against the glass, a lonely sound in the vast, empty house. The folder was hidden now, buried behind the legitimate history of the family, wrapped in oilcloth to preserve it. It was a seed planted in the dark, waiting for the rain that would not come. The water flowed freely through the Thorne irrigation pipes that season, green and life-giving, while the fields next door turned brown and brittle. The harvest was abundant. The debt was paid. But the silence in the house grew louder with every passing year, a weight that settled on the shoulders of the boy who had listened at the door. To understand the cost of that harvest, we must look closer at the soil. The drought did not break in 1989, nor in 1990. It settled into the region like a permanent resident, changing the economy of Oakhaven from one of growth to one of survival. While the surrounding counties saw foreclosure signs sprouting like weeds along the highway fences, the Thorne Ranch remained an island of unnatural green. From the air, the pivot irrigation circles were perfect emeralds set in a sea of oxidized rust. The neighbors noticed. They noticed the pumps running late into the night, the hum vibrating through the ground for miles. They noticed that the Thorne wells never ran dry, even when the county declared a water emergency and restricted usage to essential livestock only. There were whispers at the grain elevator, quiet conversations that stopped when Elias walked into the room. He was 25 then, managing the books, driving the trucks, carrying the weight of a name that was beginning to feel heavy on his shoulders. The struggle was not financial for the Thornes, but it was visceral for everyone else. The Miller farm, directly west of the Thorne boundary, was the first to fall. Old Man Miller had been Arthur's friend once. They had shared equipment and Sunday dinners. But by 1995, the Miller fields were dust bowls. The soil had turned to powder, blowing across the property line in thick, choking clouds that coated the Thorne trucks in a layer of gray grit. Elias remembered driving over to the Miller house to offer a check, a charity payment his father had authorized. He remembered the look on Mrs. Miller's face. She didn't take the check. She stood on the porch, the paint peeling behind her, and told him that water finds its own level. She said that you cannot steal from the earth without the earth taking something back. Elias had left the check on the railing. It blew away in the wind before he reached his truck. Inside the Thorne house, the atmosphere was suffocating. Arthur Thorne was aging poorly. The defiance in his jaw had hardened into something brittle. He drank more. He slept less. He spent hours in the office with the door locked, the green desk lamp burning late into the night. Elias would hear him moving around, shuffling papers, opening and closing the safe. The mechanical clicks of the dial had become a soundtrack to Elias' adulthood. He began to keep his own records. He tracked the pump hours, the acreage irrigated, the rainfall data from the county station. The numbers did not add up. The volume of water flowing through the Thorne pipes exceeded the legal allowance for their acreage by nearly 40%. There was no secondary source. There was no new well permit. The water was coming from somewhere else, or someone else's allocation was being siphoned into their lines. Elias confronted his father about it in the winter of 1998. The house was cold, the heating bill having been cut despite the wealth in the bank. Arthur sat in his leather chair, a blanket over his legs, his hands shaking slightly. When Elias presented the ledger pointing to the discrepancy in the gallons pumped versus the inches of rain recharged, Arthur did not deny it. He looked at the book, then at his son, with eyes that were tired and wet. He told Elias that the law was written by men who had never farmed. He said that survival was the only law that mattered. He told Elias that if they stopped pumping, the bank would call the notes and everything would be lost. He framed it as a choice between ruin and sin. He asked Elias if he was willing to lose the legacy for the sake of a technicality. Elias had no answer. He took the ledger and walked out. He did not burn it. He hid it in the same drawer where he kept his mother's jewelry. The tension grew with every season. The Millers lost the farm to a conglomerate that strip-mined the topsoil and left. The neighbors stopped coming to the Thorne barn dances. The phone stopped ringing. The isolation was complete. Arthur suffered a stroke in 2005. He survived, but his speech was slurred, his right side weak. He could no longer go to the office. He could no longer spin the dial on the safe. The responsibility fell entirely to Elias. He had the key to the office, but not the combination to the safe. Arthur would watch him from his wheelchair, his eyes following Elias whenever he entered the room. It was a silent guard duty. The secret was no longer just about water. It was about the health of the father and the sanity of the son. In 2010, Arthur died. The funeral was sparsely attended. The earth was hard when they buried him, the grave digger having to use a jackhammer to break the surface. Elias inherited everything: the land, the debt, the machinery, and the office. He stood in the room after the mourners had left, the silence ringing in his ears. He walked to the safe. His hand hovered over the dial. He knew the combination. His father had whispered it to him in the hospital, delirious with morphine, thinking he was speaking to his wife. Elias knew he could open it. He knew the folder was inside, wrapped in oilcloth. He knew that whatever was in there was the reason the Millers had lost their home. He knew it was the reason the town hated them. But he also knew that opening it might validate the theft. It might make it real. If he never opened it, maybe it was just a rumor, maybe it was just business. He turned the dial once, then twice. He stopped. He could not bring himself to lock eyes with the truth yet. He left the safe closed. He continued to farm. He continued to pump the water. The crops grew tall. The bank accounts swelled. But every time the irrigation pumps hummed to life, Elias heard the voice of Mrs. Miller on the porch. He heard the jackhammer breaking the ground for his father's grave. He felt the weight of the water in the pipes, heavy and stolen. The years rolled on, turning decades. The secret festered, rotting the foundation of the house from the inside out. Elias grew older. His hair turned gray. The lines on his face deepened. He became his father, and that terrified him more than the drought ever had. He began to dream of water, not the green, life-giving water of his fields, but the brown, churning floodwaters of a dam breaking. He would wake up sweating, the sheets soaked, the sound of rushing water still ringing in his ears. He knew he could not keep the safe closed forever. The pressure was building. The earth was waiting. To know what finally forced his hand, we must look at the breaking point. The winter of 2022 was the coldest Oakhaven had seen in a generation. The frost penetrated the ground so deeply that the pipes in the old office building froze, bursting along the eastern wall where the safe was embedded. Water leaked onto the concrete floor, steaming in the unheated room, threatening the contents of the metal box that had stood sentinel for 30 years. Elias had no choice. He called the locksmith, a young man who did not know the history of the Thorne name, only the weight of the tumblers. When the door swung open with a groan of rusted hinges, the air that drifted out was stale, smelling of old paper, and the distinct metallic scent of dried ink. Inside, wrapped in the oilcloth his father had used decades prior, lay the manila folder. It was heavier than it looked. Elias sat in his father's leather chair, the same one Arthur had occupied during those smoke-filled nights in 1988. The office was silent, save for the dripping of the burst pipe into a bucket nearby. Drip, drip, drip. A metronome counting down the seconds of a life built on a lie. Elias unfolded the oilcloth. The paper inside was yellowed, brittle at the edges. It was the original water rights agreement, the one the stranger had left behind. But it was not just a contract. Tucked inside the fold was a handwritten letter from Arthur, dated 3 days after the signing. Elias recognized the handwriting immediately. The loops of the A and the sharp cross of the T were etched into his memory from countless checks and lesson books. He began to read. The letter was not a justification. It was a calculation. Arthur wrote about the geology of the aquifer. He detailed how the Thorne wells were positioned to create a cone of depression that would inevitably draw the water table away from the Miller property within 18 months. He knew. He had known from the start that the diversion would not just share the water. It would steal it all. He wrote that the Miller family would be forced to sell within 5 years. He wrote that the land would be available for purchase at a fraction of its value once the water was gone. He referred to the neighbors not as friends, but as obstacles. The final line of the letter chilled Elias more than the winter wind outside. Arthur had written, "Elias is too young to understand. When he is old enough, the land will be his. He will not ask where the water came from." Elias dropped the letter. It fluttered to the floor, landing face up near his boots. He stared at the words, but they began to blur. The room tilted. The leather of the chair creaked as he gripped the arms, his knuckles turning white. He felt a physical nausea, a rolling sickness that started in his gut and rose to his throat. He stumbled to the window, looking out over the fields. The snow covered the ground, white and pure, hiding the dead earth beneath. He thought of Mrs. Miller on the porch. He thought of the check blowing away in the wind. He realized then that his charity had been an insult. He had been offering crumbs from a table built on their starvation. He had managed the farm for 20 years after his father's death, pumping the water, signing the checks, maintaining the lie. He was not an innocent heir. He was an accomplice. He sank to the floor, sitting amidst the dust and the dripping water. The moral weight of it pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He could burn the letter. He could put the folder back in the safe and lock it. No one knew it was there. The county records had been lost in a flood in 1995. There was no paper trail to contradict this document. He could keep the land. He could keep the wealth. He could pass it to Sarah or to a child he never had. The logic of survival, the same logic his father had used, whispered in his ear. You did not sign it. You were just a boy. But Elias knew that silence was a signature. Every year he kept the pumps running was a new signature on that contract. Every harvest was a witness to the theft. He looked at the letter again. The ink was dry, but the stain on his conscience was wet and fresh. He thought of the auction block in part 1. He thought of the crowd. He realized that keeping the land was no longer possible. The earth itself felt contaminated. To walk on it was to walk on grave soil. To sell it was to admit the guilt. To keep it was to live the lie. He picked up the letter. His hands were shaking so violently the paper rustled like dry leaves. He folded it back into the manila folder. He stood up, his legs weak, and walked to the desk. He did not put it back in the safe. He placed it on the surface in the light. He knew what he had to do. He could not fix the past. He could not bring the Miller farm back. But he could stop the future. He could ensure that no one else profited from the theft. The land had to go. The money did not matter. The name did not matter. Only the truth mattered, and the truth was too heavy to carry into the next generation. He walked out of the office, leaving the light on, the folder exposed in the dim room, waiting for the morning. The decision was made. The sacrifice was calculated. Now he only had to face the town. The closing papers were signed 3 days after the auction, in a conference room that smelled of stale coffee and toner. The conglomerate representatives were efficient, their suits pressed sharp enough to cut, their handshakes dry and impersonal. They did not ask why a man would sell a profitable enterprise at the peak of its value. They did not ask about the water rights or the history of the soil. They only cared about the signature. Elias signed his name on the final line, the pen moving across the paper with a scratch that sounded loud in the quiet room. When he set the pen down, he felt lighter, as if he had set down a burden he had been carrying since he was 10 years old. The wire transfer cleared that afternoon. The number in the account was substantial, enough to buy a dozen farms, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. It was the price of the land, plus the value of the water, plus the interest of 30 years of silence. Elias did not keep a cent. He had already drafted the paperwork before entering the conference room. The funds were divided into trusts, designated for the heirs of the Miller family, the neighbors who had lost their home when the wells ran dry. He included the families of 2 other farms that had folded during the drought, their failures indirectly caused by the Thorne diversion. There was no press release. There was no public announcement. He simply mailed the certified letters via registered post, leaving no room for refusal, no opportunity for debate. He knew money could not bring back the land. It could not restore the lost years or the dignity of those who had been forced to leave Oakhaven. But it was a recognition of the debt. It was an admission that the wealth in his account was not earned but taken. Sarah met him at the house as the sun was setting on the day the transfers were confirmed. The furniture was gone, packed into crates or sold to dealers from the city. The walls were bare, leaving only the ghostly outlines of framed photographs where the paint had not faded. She stood in the doorway of the office, the same room where their father had signed the original deal. She looked at Elias, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. She did not ask him why he had given it all away. She had seen the folder on the podium. She had heard the whispers in the town. She knew that keeping the money would have been like keeping the blood on their hands. She handed him a box. Inside was the silver-capped fountain pen their father had used in 1988. She told him he should keep it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Elias took the pen. He weighed it in his hand, feeling the cold metal, the history of the ink that had signed away a community's future. He placed it in his pocket. The town's reaction was not one of anger, but of a heavy, somber respect. The neighbors who had avoided his gaze at the auction now nodded when they saw his truck on the road. They did not wave, and they did not stop to talk. The truth had changed the landscape of their relationships. He was no longer the heir to the empire. He was the man who had paid the bill. There was no forgiveness in their eyes, only an acknowledgement that the balance had been restored. The land would belong to strangers now, corporate entities that would farm it with algorithms and drones, but the water rights would revert to the county pool, accessible to those who remained. The theft was ended. The cycle was broken. Elias loaded the last of his belongings into the cab of his truck. It was not much. A duffel bag, the box with the pen, and the manila folder, now empty of its secrets. He walked around the house one last time. The wind was picking up, swirling the dry grass around the foundation. The irrigation pipes stood silent in the fields, rusting monuments to a war that was finally over. He thought about the water beneath his feet. It did not care about ownership. It did not care about deeds or signatures. It flowed where it wanted, ancient and indifferent to the struggles of the men who walked on the surface. He got into the truck and started the engine. The sound was familiar, a rumble that had been the soundtrack of his life. He put the vehicle in gear and drove toward the county line. He did not look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing to see but the past receding into the dust. Sarah stood on the porch, a small figure against the vast sky, watching him go. She would stay. She had chosen to remain in Oakhaven, to live in the town where the truth was known, to build something new on the honest ground. Elias drove on, the road stretching out before him, flat and endless. He had no destination. He had no home. He had only the knowledge that he had done the only thing he could. The check was cashed. The debt was paid. The land would remain long after the names on the deeds had turned to dust. Truth, he realized, was not a thing you owned. It was a thing you owed. And in the end, the earth always collects what is due.